Well, they may have been negligible in total numbers, but they were very far from stupid. They have triumphed under Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, and to the present. They've now basically taken over both political parties, the Republicans to an extreme extent, and a good deal of the intellectual culture. It's kind of interesting that today Bernie Sanders is considered a radical revolutionary, far off the political spectrum, for voicing beliefs pretty similar to Dwight Eisenhower's. It tells us a lot about what's happened in the past couple of generations. The achievements of the neoliberal economy greatly impressed elite opinion. That included the economics profession, which hailed what they called the Great Moderation. They confidently assured the public that recessions were a thing of the past. Now that sophisticated market theories were able to keep inflation under control and ensure steady growth, to be sure, for a very small percentage of the population. The master of Greenstone was called St. Allen, considered one of the great economists of the ages. That was before the whole structure that he supervised collapsed in a shambles that would have become worse than the Great Depression if had it not been for drastic actions to somehow rescue the economy. Well, while he was still basking in glory, St. Allen instructed Congress on the reasons for his success in managing the flourishing economy. His success, he explained, relied on what he called growing worker insecurity. As he explained, the workers were so intimidated that even when unemployment was very low, they were simply afraid to ask for better wages and benefits. And that's very good because it means that there's no inflationary pressure, and that we didn't bother to mention it. It means that profits can soar sky high. Again, what's happening today. Well, that was during the boom of the 90s, which soon led to a bust, though nothing like the crash 10 years ago, which was caused by predatory lending for homes, complex financial instruments to obscure the sheer robbery, all thanks to deregulation. Can you hear me? Stop again. Let's see.
They can hear. They can hear.
Hear me again? I've had a lot of experience with these video conferences. In third world countries, they sometimes break down, also in the United States. Some lessons there too. Well, going back to the boom of the 90s, when St. Allen was explaining about the wonders of greater worker insecurity, that led to a bust, nothing like the last one. After the crash, Congress passed legislation. Legislation would have two parts. First part was to bail out the perpetrators, ended up richer than before. And the second part was to help the victims, the homeowners, who were devastated by the predatory behavior of the banks and financial institutions. Well, anyone who understands the logic of modern capitalism could easily have predicted which of the two prongs was executed. It was a giveaway to Wall Street executives, the special inspector general of the bailout program, Neil Ferofsky, argued, complaining bitterly about the failure of the Obama administration to pursue that half of the legislation, of course, in vain. Well, the general public may not know the details, but nevertheless, they can readily grasp what's happening. Their anger and resentment, very easy prey for a con man who pretends to be their defender against the hated elites, while in fact he's stabbing them in the back at every turn. The prime example is the most prized achievement of the Trump administration, the tax bill that economist Joseph Stiglitz described as the U.S. Donor Relief Act of 2017. The bill lavishes gifts on the very wealthy corporate sector and brings an extra benefit. It created a huge deficit on purpose, of course. The purpose was cheerfully explained right away by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, the architects of the program. As they pointed out, we now have this terrible deficit, and in order to deal with it, it's necessary to reduce the already meager social spending for the general population. Health, education, food support for the poor, other irrelevancies of the neoliberal era. Well, this growing worker insecurity that St. Allen lauded as the basis for a healthy economy, that's been enhanced by the way employment has been changed during the neoliberal period. Increasingly, the economy is designed to create a precarious existence, what's sometimes called the new precariat. The mass of the victims are sometimes called. There's a recent study by two prominent labor economists, Princeton, Lawrence Katz, Alan Kruger. They found, I'm quoting them, that 94% of the net employment growth in the U.S. economy from 2005 to 2015 appears to have occurred in alternative work arrangements. 94%, part-time, temporary, irregular, a few employer commitments, individual arrangements. Well, people who are cast aside by social and economic policies and see a bleak future, they quite naturally feel resentment, anger, fear, and it's all too easy for these feelings to be directed to scapegoats, commonly those who are even more vulnerable. That's particularly true among populations that have been atomized by policies that are aimed at undermining the social order, guided by Margaret Thatcher's famous maxim that there's no society, only individuals. That was Thatcher's unwitting paraphrase of Karl Marx, who bitterly condemned the authoritarian rulers of Europe in the mid-19th century for seeking to turn society into what he called a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass of isolated people who confront concentrated power alone. Concentration of wealth and power automatically translate to decline of democracy. The means are too familiar to review. Extensive research has shown that by now a large majority of voters are literally disenfranchised, and that their own representatives pay no attention to their wishes, but listen to other voices, the voices of the donor class, top tiny percentile. It's furthermore well established that elections are pretty much bought. Electability and hence policy is predictable with remarkable precision by the single variable of campaign spending that works both for the executive and for Congress. Tom Ferguson's work is particularly revealing. It goes back into the 19th century. It includes the 2016 election. And that's a bare beginning. During the neoliberal period, the number of lobbyists has just exploded. Legislation is commonly shaped, even sometimes actually written by corporate lobbyists, while the representatives who sign it have their eyes on funding for the next election. As both parties shifted to the right in the neoliberal years, the Democrats, as I mentioned, have abandoned the working class, and the Republicans have just drifted off the spectrum. And the leadership understands that. They understand that they cannot get votes on their actual policies. So what they've done over the years is to try to mobilize a voting constituency on other grounds, what are sometimes called cultural grounds, keeping away from the crucial socioeconomic policies. One very revealing case of this, one of many, is the matter of abortion rights. If you go back to the 1960s, the Republican Party was strongly pro-choice. That included the leadership. Reagan, Ford, George H.W. Bush, Bush the First, Goldwater, and others. And the same with Republican voters. In 1972, 2/3 of Republicans believed that abortion is a private matter. The government should have no involvement. Well, Nixon and his cohorts realized that, and along with their famous Southern strategy, they could attract the Catholic vote, which had usually been Democratic, simply by adopting a strong anti-abortion plank. A couple of years later, evangelicals began to be organized for political action. The Republican operative, Paul Weyrich, he recognized an opportunity. Among the demands of the newly organized evangelicals was demands for segregated schools. Weyrich realized that you can't call for that, but he had another proposal, namely the Republican Party should pretend to oppose abortion. And if it did, it could pick up the evangelical vote. That's now a core part of Trump's voting base. And the leadership accordingly shifted to passionate pro-life advocates. Reagan, Ford, all the rest. That included those who are sometimes believed to have some character and honesty, like George Bush the First. Well, meanwhile, of course, the actual Republican constituency remains as it has been. Great wealth, corporate power, even more brazenly so under Trump. And it's quite an impressive achievement to serve the actual constituency with dedication while somehow maintaining hold on the voting constituency. A voting constituency that is shrinking. The leadership understands that they're becoming more and more a minority party, which is, of course, why they're so dedicated to find modes of voter suppression and packing the courts with reactionaries who will support their efforts, as the Roberts Court has so far done. The election highlighted related and ominous developments. So the Republicans increased their Senate majority. How? With 42% of the votes against 57% for the losing Democrats. Right now, 60 senators are elected by 25% of the population. That's rural, white, religious, heavily armed, and the tendency is increasing. It's hard to see how some form of civil conflict can be avoided if this continues, unless the Democrats reverse course sharply and become a political party that doesn't simply abandon the working class, as they've done for 40 years.